you've been welcome to here.
That introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming today. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to your questions. I work on narratives, and the reason I got into that is that I've been looking at sustainable food systems and how we can achieve them for most of my professional life. And there's widespread agreement that there are serious problems with our food system. I'm not sure how many of you in this room are familiar with food systems. And if you are, there may be some material here that you say, oh yeah, I know all that. But hopefully there'll be some new things too. Despite this widespread agreement on the problems, especially the environmental problems, there's really no consensus about solutions and how we're going to transform the food system, largely because people don't agree about why those problems are there. Some people say, well, basically it's capitalism, and you need to do something about capitalism. And some people will say, oh, it's just that there aren't enough technological solutions out there that people are using. So lots and lots of different ideas. And I started collecting these ideas and trying to analyze them to figure out, well, what's behind them? Come on in. I saw Carlos Andres. There. Okay. Have a seat. Have a seat. So narratives, for folks who aren't familiar with them, they're very simple. They're the stories that we tell ourselves about why the world works. And this is a more formal definition up at the beginning. Courses of action with a beginning, a middle, and an end, used by humans to make sense of experiences. If we didn't have narratives, we would just be overwhelmed with perceptions. So narratives allow us to say, okay, this fits in this pattern, this fits in that pattern. I can ignore all this extraneous stuff over here because it doesn't really fit the narrative. And narratives have a chronicle, a sequence of events, as well as the interpretation of those events' meanings. And they're important because they serve to uphold certain perspectives. Climate denialism is a narrative that's still amazingly strong in this country, despite all the, I would say, irrefutable evidence that climate change is here. The value of indigenous knowledge about land management, another very important narrative that's gaining strength amongst scientific communities. Narratives also allow us to assign responsibility to certain actors or to exculpate other actors from responsibility. Oh, it's not their fault, that's not part of the narrative. And to influence funding streams and support. So people really fight over these narratives. It's a matter of money. I see two big meta-narratives that are active now in food systems. One is the extractive industrialized food system that truly is dominant in the United States. And according to that meta-narrative, food is a commodity to be produced in exchange for profit. Profit is the most important thing about food, according to that meta-narrative. The other is regenerative food systems. And according to this narrative, meta-narrative, food is a public good with multiple values. Its production, distribution, and consumption are all subject to human rights. So these are the two meta-narratives that I've been working with. And then I have a lot of sub-narratives that I fit under those. When I talk about regenerative food systems, I should probably say that what I mean by that is a system that restores ecological integrity to the greatest extent possible, that builds the agency of people to grow and consume healthy food, and provides fair wages, both for farmers and for farm workers, by sharing the value of food. Nobody's accumulating that value, which is part of capitalism. I don't mean regenerative agriculture. And I've written about regenerative agriculture a few times because I really see regenerative agriculture as a narrative that's been co-opted by business and by some farm organizations to mean making money from carbon credits by sequestering more carbon in soil. Maybe some of you are working on regenerative agriculture, and I'd be glad to share that publication that we did through IPES-Food that compared agroecology with regenerative agriculture and nature-based solutions, which is another of these things that World Wildlife Fund and some of the big environmental organizations like. Regenerative agriculture does have some benefits, there's no question about that. It helps to restore soil fertility and sequestration capacity, but it's a very limited concept, especially compared to agroecology. So common narratives can be divided. When I say that the industrialized narrative is still out there, this is an example. This came out September 5th. And this is USAID's climate strategy. And it's all about sustainable intensification, which is industrialized agriculture. There's nothing in here about agroecology, or what I would see as a far more progressive way forward. I was just on a call this morning with a fellow from the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, Middlebury, and that's what they are pushing for. These people from USAID are saying, well, what Africa needs is sustainable intensification, but people within Africa are saying we want agroecology. So I wish USAID would listen to the people on the ground a little bit better. Alive and Well, and also there's a program called AGRA, used to be called the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. They dropped Green Revolution because they realized, hey, this isn't so popular these days. A lot of people have recognized that the Green Revolution had some major problems. So they still call it AGRA, A-G-R-A, but they've dropped Green Revolution. So who knows what the acronym stands for these days. But you can still call it AGRA. That's still perfectly accurate. So some of the sub-narratives that I pulled out don't require structural changes in power relations in the food system. And in just a minute, I'll get to why that's so important. I see power relations as the major thing that needs to be changed to transform food systems in the direction of regeneration. These are all sub-narratives. Sustainable intensification, which is really just productivism with a little green veneer on top of it. Technological innovation, one of the big things that was promoted in the UN Food Systems Summit that happened in 2021. Did anyone tune into that? Not all that important in Vermont. It happened in Rome, and it was this big deal. Huge amounts of money were spent on it, like millions of dollars. But they were all about technological innovation. That's what they highlighted, corporations that were employing technological innovation. Scientific knowledge, and some of you may bristle a little at that and say, well, scientific knowledge, that's what we do. Surely that's going to transform food systems, but in my view, unless you combine it with a really solid understanding of behavioral change, and if you get those scientific findings added to the public through independent media, which is a little hard to do because most of our mainstream media is owned by big corporations now. Koch brothers, the Murdoch family, they are big in media. But scientific knowledge alone is never going to transform the food system. Multi-stakeholder initiatives, something that civil society is really hot under the collar about. International summits, things like this big UN Food System Summit, and intergovernmental agreements. I put intergovernmental agreements on here because the intergovernmental agreements are all constrained by the socio-political systems of the governments from which the delegates come. If delegates start talking about things that are for the public good, that are going to improve the well-being of everyone instead of just the well-being of their country, they're going to get yanked pretty soon. So intergovernmental agreements really don't change the power relations in the food system. These are some in yellow that do require structural changes in power relations that will enable regeneration. Remember, I said regeneration has to include things like fair wages. That's going to be a major power shift because corporations are making the lion's share of the profits now in the food system. Rights-based approaches, food democracy, cultural shifts, value shifts, social innovation, agroecology, and food sovereignty. And these are more or less lined up. I put agroecology and food sovereignty down at the bottom because those are the two that I place the most hopes on for actually transforming the food system. But all of these things working together are necessary, and they do work together. For instance, agroecology includes the right to food. It is obviously part of a rights-based approach. And then there are a few things that can support either meta-narrative, depending on how they're framed. One is legal strategies. Legal strategies can be very positive. We've seen some great things in Vermont. For instance, migrant workers being allowed to get driver's licenses. That was through legal action. We've seen the Pickford settlements by which Black farmers in the United States got payment for years and years of discrimination by USDA. So lots of good things from legal strategies, but at the same time, they are upholding some pretty awful things like investor-state dispute settlements, which is a bizarre mechanism by which corporations can sue a country if they enact policies that mean that the corporation does not get the expected payout from their investment in that country. So if they are putting in place environmental protections or social protections, corporations can sue them. And they've actually won many of these suits. Government policies and programs. Again, there's some great ones out there and the potential is huge, but a lot of them are just plain bad, especially in the United States where government policies and programs tend to uphold the largest farmers, industrialized farmers. So let me see if I'm missing anything here. I look both at narratives of what will transform food systems, that was what I just showed you, but also who has that power. And the who's that I have been examining are large businesses, philanthropists, consumers, vote with your fork, farmers, policymakers, and civil society. So I'm saying it's not just this mechanism that you think, but might make a difference, but also who has the power. You have to look at that. The assumptions that are underlying many of the widely promoted theories of change in food systems are flawed because the likely result simply won't be a regenerative food system with ecological integrity, improved well-being for all, justice, or the necessary preconditions for that switch don't exist. If you start looking at trends or the logic of how change will happen, just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. So that's something I've been working on just over the last few days. What is the theory of change under each of those what's that I showed you in the last two? So these are my main premises in my work. Power relations, key to transformation, as I mentioned. Transformation needs to involve actors throughout the system. So if you're just looking at one or two actors, if you're saying, basically, if philanthropists will fund the right things, then we can transform the food system. I would say, no, that's not going to be enough. Transformation requires both support for the entities that already hold regenerative values, like farmers and businesses that are trying to operate in the right way, and weakening the sources of power on which extractive systems draw. And I'll show you some of those sources of power in just a few minutes. It also requires changing the dominant public narrative so that regeneration becomes normalized. It's what people expect and want. And when they find food in the supermarket that is not from regenerative sources, they say, no way, I'm not about to buy this stuff. Which is what I hope will do. So power in the food system. Power is a flow. And this is my diagram of how power flows. It flows through actors and leads to an accumulation of market or political capacity. And these are closely interrelated. Corporations have leveraged their market dominance, and corporations are far and away the most powerful entities in the food system now. There's really no question about that. But they've leveraged that market power into political strength. We see this domestically, and we see it increasingly in international forums, such as the Committee on World Food Security and the UN system overall. So these are the main actors in the food system here. Note that the dominant narrative, the cultural narrative, sits right here in the middle. And look at the number of things that it's able to affect. All these arrows coming out from the cultural narrative. Some other things. Here's business down here. And business makes profits. And they have many choices for how they invest those profits. They can be investing them in campaign finance and lobbying to influence policymakers. They can be investing them in bought media, which is all too common. Pieces that you think are independent, but they are actually written by people from corporations. They can also be investing in advertising to get you to buy stuff from them, and to buy things like ultra-processed food that is really bad for you, that's really the main culprit behind the obesity epidemic that has been surging in the United States, still going on, and that the United States, with our food corporations, has exported to other countries. So those are some of the ways that they could invest their profits. They might also invest their profits in restoration. That's always a choice. Restoring communities, providing land back to indigenous communities. That's something that a food business could do. It would be very valuable for PR for some of their customers, but do food businesses do that? No, they are not the ones who are doing it. They could also be investing more in their producers by sharing the profits that they're making. But again, they aren't doing that. They have a fiduciary responsibility, if they're corporations, to maximize returns to shareholders, which I think is a really stupid thing for us to have ever allowed to pass. So let me show you another diagram here. This is showing what I was just talking about, the investments in legislative influence, in media, and the cultural narrative. Here are the corporate assets that come out in profits. Profits are augmented by sales. If anybody's familiar with Dana Meadows' system of systems analysis, I'm using the kinds of icons that she uses. So these are all the ways that corporations build their assets: mergers and acquisitions, subsidies, deliveries from producers, which gets stuff into the corporation, and reinvestment, which is this reinforcing loop here. And then these are all balancing loops that can draw down those corporate assets: taxes, depreciation, and then sales of product. And then these are ways that they're investing their profit. These are all ways, potential balancing loops, that are blocked by corporate investment. So all the things that are in the box, increased taxation, limits on lobbying, limits on campaign financing, legislation to require that they internalize the environmental and social externalities, limits on media influence, and stricter antitrust implementation. These are all things that corporations block, and they block it vehemently. A lot of this is done by their influence on policymakers. And let me just show you a few examples of how this works out. These are 2022, a great website, Open Secrets. I hope you all know about it. These are annual investments spent by agribusiness on lobbying, the total $169 million. And over here we have the total money to Congress, total $59 million to all candidates, with a little more going to the Republicans than to the Democrats, but they always want to hedge their bets in case a Democrat gets in power after all. This is an interesting study that was done by the Rockefeller Foundation, which is hardly what I would call super progressive. They're a fairly mainstream conservative organization, but they were measuring the true cost of food. And what they found is that people spend $1.1 trillion every year on food in the United States. But if you reckon all of the externalities from the food system, that adds on another 2.1 trillion environmental costs, greenhouse gases. In fact, greenhouse gases and loss of biodiversity were the two major ones. And if you add those up, then this is the true cost of the food system. So this is a study that's showing all these externalities that corporations are able now to foist off on other people, marginalized populations, future generations, the environment, us. So that's all problematic, and they would like to continue that. And remember, I was showing you that subsidies are one of the ways that corporations gain power. A study that was done, what was this, 2021, by FAO and the UN Development Program and the UN Environment Program found that 90% of the $540 billion that are spent in subsidies to farmers are harmful to the environment, harmful to communities. So this is where the money's going, to all of these things that build up corporate power and hurt the public interest. And this is exactly what regenerative agriculture is designed to combat. So let me show you two diagrams. This first is by voting with your fork. You've probably all heard that. Michael Pollan popularized it. You can vote 3 times a day. All you have to do is vote with your fork. The reason why that is not effective, here's that same diagram I showed you earlier. If people vote with their fork, what this means is that there are more purchases. That's what this line of influence is. Citizens buying from producers or buying from food businesses. And then there's secondary impacts on environmental quality, public health, and well-being, which is all great, but it does nothing for this whole web of power that the producers and food businesses are locked within. So all of this is still going on, the investment in campaign finance and lobbying, the advertising, everything else. So vote with your fork, okay, although it's generally only okay for people who have the privilege of being able to choose what they eat. But it has very little impact on power relations. And then if you compare that diagram with what happens if you change the cultural narrative, that's what I'm trying to show in this diagram. if you change the cultural narrative, and usually, well, it can happen through several ways. And that's something I'm working on right now, and I'd love your thoughts about how to change the cultural narrative. Civil society works hard on changing that cultural narrative, changing from industrialized to regenerative. To a certain extent, people in media are working on it, like Damian Carrington from The Guardian. He's in that. Fewer people in US media, but definitely places like Civil Eats and the independent food media. But if you change that cultural narrative, look at all the impacts, these heavy lines to policymakers, to citizens, building awareness on environmental quality, public health and well-being, changing the media, changing producers, changing food businesses. These are all impacts that you can have by changing that cultural narrative. And then you're changing almost the whole diagram through secondary impacts, these dashed lines everywhere. So yeah, there could still be some bad stuff going on, but this is a far more effective change strategy than something like voting with your fork. So I just have one more, and I'm very close to the end of my time too. Ideas of how a just and sustainable food system can be created within our current socioeconomic system. Sometimes my students get really frustrated and end up saying, well, we just need to tear down capitalism, which is a little bit, that's a long-term project, to say the least. And maybe that's what we do need to do, or at least get out of neoliberalism, this variant of capitalism that we're stuck in right now. But what we want to do is to build up alternatives, these small initiatives that fit in the interstices that might scale up as the industrialized system encounters its own contradictions and problems, like running out of resources. That's a big one right now. Phosphorus is in low supply. We can incorporate power through policy and purchasing choices. And these are three policies that are sort of up for grabs right now. The marker bills for the Farm Bill. If I want to know what's on the table for policy, I go to the National Family Farm Coalition. They are on top of it, or the National Sustainable Agriculture Campaign, both good places. Farmland for Farmers Act is preventing corporations from buying up land. Fair Credit for Farmers Act is exactly what it says it is. Increasing Land Access Security and Opportunities Act is really aimed at beginning farmers, making it easier for beginning farmers to get land access. And that is the biggest barrier right now for beginning farmers in the United States. First, land access, second, credit. And then third, changing the dominant narrative. And these are some things that are percolating out in the public now that already have some traction that I think would help to move us toward a regenerative food system. Food is a right, not a charity. There's a group of people trying to get the right to food into state constitutions all over the country, especially a nascent movement in Vermont even, but Wyoming, Washington, West Virginia are all working on that. Keeping oil in the ground, a big one that's coming up for COP28. And believe me, that's not going to be a strong narrative because COP28 is being run by a fossil fuel corporate executive. Fair wages and working conditions for labor, increasing the minimum wage to a living wage. I'm sure you all know that our minimum wage is nowhere near a living wage, even for a single person, much less a person who has children to support. And then agroecology, not extractive food systems. And the Institute for Agroecology is working hard on that changing that final narrative and trying to build support for agroecology. But these are all things that I see as having a lot of potential. So that's all I have, and I look forward to your questions.